Nobody is asking why Washington chose this specific moment to offer Canada a way out. That is the question. Not whether Canada will accept the conditional exemption, not whether the tariff relief is genuine or performative, not whether Mark Carney has the political will to resist or the pragmatic instinct to negotiate. The question that cuts underneath all of those surface questions is the one that reveals the entire architecture of what is actually happening between Washington, Ottawa, and Beijing right now on May 16, 2026. Why now? Why not 6 months ago, when the tariff pressure was at its most intense and Canadian business leaders were loudest in their concern? Why not 6 months from now, when the political calendar in both countries would look different? Why exactly now, at the specific moment when Canada's alternative economic architecture, the one built quietly and deliberately across 5 continents in under a year, is beginning to produce results that were supposed to be impossible? The answer to why now is the answer to every other question about this negotiation. Because the original theory behind the tariff pressure was that economic pain would overcome political will before Canada's diversification strategy became real enough to sustain the pain. That theory is not playing out the way Washington calculated. And Washington, recognizing that the window for forcing Canada's hand is narrowing rather than widening, has made its move. The conditional exemption offer is not an olive branch. It is a clock with a deadline attached. And the price of accepting it is the dismantling of the single most consequential piece of diplomatic architecture Canada has built in the last decade. Understanding exactly what that means, what is being offered, what is being demanded, and what happens in each of the possible outcomes is what this script is about. Because what is being decided in Ottawa's inbox right now is not a bilateral trade dispute between 2 North American neighbors. It is a test case for whether smaller economies can maintain meaningful sovereignty in a world where 2 superpowers are demanding that every nation choose a lane and stay in it. And the result of that test will echo in capitals across Southeast Asia, Africa, and Latin America that are watching this specific negotiation to understand what their own choices cost. Let me set the scene with the precision this moment requires, because the sequence of events that produced the conditional exemption offer matters as much as the offer itself. And most of the coverage has been treating the offer as an isolated development rather than as the product of a strategic progression that has been unfolding since January. In January of this year, Mark Carney flew to Beijing and became the first Canadian Prime Minister in nearly a decade to sit across from Chinese leadership at that level of formal diplomatic engagement. He met with President Xi Jinping. He met with Premier Li Qiang. He met with the chairman of the Standing Committee of the National People's Congress. He signed a new strategic partnership covering trade, energy, and aerospace. And in that agreement, China made a specific and measurable commitment. Chinese tariffs on Canadian canola seed would drop from a combined rate of approximately 84% down to approximately 15%. For Canadian farmers, who had been locked out of one of the world's largest agricultural markets for years, that number was not a diplomatic abstraction. It was a livelihood restored. It was the difference between a market and the absence of one. On the other side of the equation, Canada lowered its own tariff on Chinese electric vehicles from 100% down to 6.1%, with an initial cap of 49,000 vehicles. A carefully calibrated opening. Not a flood of Chinese cars into the Canadian market. A signal. A demonstration that Canada was willing to engage with commercial reality rather than exclusively with alliance political posture. Washington's reaction arrived almost immediately. Threats of 100% tariffs on Canada if the deal proceeded. Then within days, a suggestion from Trump that the deal was actually beneficial. Then more threats. 3 completely contradictory positions in 11 days. That whiplash was not an accident, and it was not confusion. It was a negotiating pattern applied to a situation that had produced an outcome Washington did not anticipate. And the pattern has continued through the spring, and now in May 2026, the conditional exemption offer has arrived. Real tariff relief, meaningful tariff relief, but with a condition attached that Canada never agreed to and may not be able to accept without destroying something it spent the last year carefully constructing. The condition, read slowly, is that Canada must apply the exact same tariffs on Chinese steel and electric vehicle batteries that the United States applies. Not similar tariffs, not comparable tariffs, identical ones, which means dismantling the January Beijing Agreement, which means telling the Canadian farmers who watched their market access to China restored in January that the access has been revoked, which means telling Beijing that Canada's exercise of independent trade judgment was a temporary experiment that ended when Washington applied sufficient pressure. That is the offer on the table as of May 16, 2026. And the reason it has arrived now rather than earlier or later is the most important analytical question surrounding the entire negotiation. Here is why timing is everything in this specific situation. The theory that drove Washington's tariff strategy toward Canada from its beginning was straightforward in its logic and aggressive in its application. Economic pain produces political pressure. Political pressure overcomes governmental resolve. Governmental resolve collapses, and the targeted country accepts the demanding party's terms. This theory has worked at various points in American trade history with various partners. It worked with partners who had limited alternative markets, limited diplomatic relationships with other major economies, and limited institutional capacity to construct alternative economic frameworks on a short timeline. The theory was applied to Canada with the assumption that Canada's deep structural integration with the American economy, the supply chains, the shared border, the currency relationship, the energy interconnection, would make the pain of tariff pressure acute enough that diversification would be revealed as rhetoric rather than reality. A country that does 47% of its international trade across a single border does not diversify away from that border quickly. That was the calculation. What the data is now showing, and this needs to be stated with the appropriate precision about sourcing, is that the diversification strategy has been more successful than Washington's leverage calculation anticipated. According to statements made by the Canadian government, foreign direct investment into Canada is running at its highest level on a per capita basis in nearly 2 decades, at approximately twice the rate of Canada's nearest G7 competitor. More than 20 economic and security partnerships have been signed across 5 continents in under a year. These figures come from Ottawa and require independent verification against Statistics Canada and external economic sources before treating them as settled empirical fact. But even as directional claims, they describe an environment in which the global business community is treating Canada not as an economy under existential stress, but as an economy with strategic value and long-term stability in a world where that combination is increasingly rare. Every month that passes with investment flowing in, with trade agreements accumulating, with Canadian exports to non-American markets growing, the tariff threat loses a fraction of its leverage. Not all of it. The tariffs are causing real pain for real workers in steel, aluminum, and automotive sectors, and that pain is not in dispute. But the existential pressure that the tariff strategy was supposed to generate, the kind of pressure that breaks political will and forces capitulation, is being absorbed more successfully than Washington expected. The conditional exemption offer is Washington recognizing that the window is closing and acting before it closes further. Think about what this looks like from the perspective of a canola farmer in Saskatchewan. This is not a rhetorical device. This is the human dimension that gets lost in the geopolitical framing every time. A farmer who spent years watching Chinese tariffs at 84% make the Chinese market effectively inaccessible for Canadian canola, who saw that market partially restored in January through a diplomatic agreement that took years of broken relationships to rebuild, who is now watching Washington demand that Ottawa reverse that agreement as a condition of tariff relief that was triggered by Washington's own tariff offensive. This farmer is being asked to sacrifice a market access that was restored to them through patient, difficult diplomacy as the price of relief from a pressure that was applied to them through no commercial decision of their own. That is the lived human experience underneath the geopolitical architecture. And the political calculus for any Canadian government that accepts Washington's condition has to account for what that farmer is going to say in the next election. What the Alberta energy sector is going to say, what the Quebec aerospace community, which just received the largest aircraft order in Canadian history, is going to say. The economic pain being caused by American tariffs is real, but the political cost of dismantling agreements that restored market access for Canadian producers is also real. And any prime minister navigating this negotiation is managing both costs simultaneously in a domestic political environment where both have electoral consequences. Now let me show you the dimension of this story that is almost entirely absent from the mainstream coverage of the Canada-US-China triangle, and it is the dimension that makes the current negotiation genuinely consequential far beyond the specific bilateral relationship between Ottawa and Washington. Beijing is watching this very carefully and drawing very specific conclusions from what it observes. When Carney flew to Beijing in January and signed the Agricultural and Trade Agreement, that agreement was not merely an economic transaction. It was a signal, deliberate and visible, that a G7 nation could independently negotiate with China without first seeking Washington's permission. That is a strategic demonstration whose value to Beijing extends far beyond the canola tariff percentages or the electric vehicle import limits. For years, Beijing has been arguing to capitals across the developing world, across Southeast Asia, across Africa, across Latin America, that Western alliance unity on China policy is a performance rather than a substance, that individual nations, when facing real economic pressure, will make decisions based on their own commercial interests rather than collective Western alignment. The Carney-Beijing Agreement gave Beijing an empirical example to cite. A G7 nation chose to engage with China independently. Now consider the 2 possible outcomes from Beijing's perspective. If Canada is forced under American pressure to reverse that agreement, if Ottawa walks back the Beijing deal because Washington demanded it, Beijing receives a powerful narrative. One that says, look at what happened to Canada when it exercised independent judgment. Washington punished it until it reversed course. This is what the Western alliance actually costs you. That narrative travels It reaches capitals in Kuala Lumpur, in Nairobi, in Buenos Aires, in Jakarta, where governments are making their own calculations about how closely to align with American trade demands versus maintaining economic relationships with Chinese partners. If Canada holds firm and the diversification strategy continues producing measurable results, Beijing receives a different kind of demonstration. A living proof of concept that a Western allied nation can pursue independent economic relationships with China and absorb the American pressure without capitulating. That demonstration also travels, and it travels to the same capitals with an opposite message. Both outcomes serve Beijing's broader strategic argument, which is why the specific demand Washington has attached to the conditional exemption, targeting the Canada-China agreement rather than other aspects of Canadian trade policy, reveals that Washington understands the symbolic dimension of that agreement as clearly as Beijing does. The demand is not primarily about steel tariff rates or electric vehicle battery import rules. It is about whether Canada's public exercise of independent trade judgment survives or is reversed under pressure. That is the real ask, and both sides of the Pacific Ocean understand it. The U.S. Trade Representative's statement at a congressional hearing in the spring captures the underlying conflict with unusual directness. In his words, Canada is doubling down on globalization when Washington is trying to correct for the problems of globalization. Read that sentence carefully because it is not a complaint about dumping or supply chain security or any specific trade practice. It is a statement about two fundamentally incompatible visions of how the global economy should be organized. Washington's vision, at least as expressed in the current trade strategy, is one of hardening economic alliances into distinct blocs where member nations coordinate their trade policies with adversarial countries through shared frameworks. Canada's vision, as expressed in the Beijing Agreement and the broader diversification strategy, is one where sovereignty includes the right to make independent commercial decisions based on national interests, even when those decisions create friction with powerful partners. These are not compatible visions at the level of deep principle. And what is being negotiated right now in Ottawa's inbox is not which specific tariff rates apply to which specific goods. It is which vision of global economic organization governs the Canada-US relationship going forward. That is a bigger question than any trade negotiation framing is acknowledging, and the answer to it will constrain Canadian economic policy not just for the current government, but for every government that follows. Here is the paradox that sits at the center of this situation, and that represents perhaps the most consequential, underreported element of the entire story. Mark Carney has never closed the door on deeper North American integration. The concept of a jointly protected North American economic zone, giving both countries preferential access to each other's markets while presenting a unified front to the rest of the world, is something the Canadian government has explicitly described itself as remaining open to. That openness is on the record. It is genuine. It is not a bluff or a tactical concession. But Fortress North America as a viable long-term framework requires something that the conditional exemption offer is actively undermining. It requires a foundation of predictability and mutual respect sufficient to build something durable together. Deeper integration between two economies that are already the world's largest bilateral trading relationship requires both parties to trust that the rules of the partnership will not change unilaterally, that the conditions for market access will not reverse 3 times in 11 days, that the architecture of the relationship will be constructed through mutual agreement rather than imposed through economic pressure. By making demands that require Canada to dismantle the diversification architecture that demonstrates its capacity for independent strategic judgment, Washington may be destroying the conditions necessary for the deeper integration it claims to want. If Canada is treated as a dependent rather than a partner, if the relationship is framed as alignment on Washington's terms rather than as genuinely mutual construction, the political conditions in Canada that would make deeper integration democratically viable will not exist. Canadian voters will not support economic integration with a partner they have watched use economic coercion to force their government's compliance with demands it never agreed to. The short-term pressure that is supposed to produce alignment may be producing the opposite. It may be making the long-term alignment that would serve both countries' interests progressively less achievable. That is not a small irony. It is a structural contradiction that sits at the heart of the current American trade strategy toward Canada, and that nobody in the mainstream coverage of this negotiation is naming explicitly. Let me now walk through the 3 realistic scenarios for how this negotiation resolves, not as predictions but as analytical frameworks grounded in where both sides are actually positioned on May 16, 2026, and what the strategic logic of each outcome produces for each party. The first scenario is sectoral alignment. Canada agrees to restrict specific categories of Chinese goods, not the full tariff alignment Washington is demanding, but a targeted list covering certain steel grades and certain battery components that can be framed as security adjacent rather than purely economic in motivation. Enough to give Washington a political win it can describe as meaningful progress toward aligned China policy, while preserving the agricultural dimensions of the Beijing Agreement that matter most to Canadian farmers and the supply of political support they represent. This is the most transactional path. It requires both sides to accept less than their stated maximum position, which is historically how most negotiations conclude. It allows Carney to tell Saskatchewan canola farmers that their market access is protected while telling Washington that Canada is serious about coordinating on security-relevant trade. It allows Washington to claim partial victory without requiring Ottawa to completely reverse the Beijing Agreement. The risk of this scenario is that it produces the worst of both worlds. Beijing reads a partial reversal as confirmation that sufficient pressure produces compliance and recalibrates its assessment of Canada's reliability as an independent partner. Washington reads a partial compliance as confirmation that more pressure produces more movement and recalibrates its assessment of how much additional leverage it can extract. The sectoral alignment scenario stops the immediate bleeding without addressing the underlying strategic question about Canada's long-term posture. The second scenario is the security carve-out. Canada proposes a formal separation between security cooperation and commercial trade policy. Deep alignment with Washington on defense, intelligence sharing, critical minerals, technology standards, and the specific categories of goods and investments that carry genuine security implications. But explicit, publicly acknowledged autonomy on purely commercial trade relationships that do not implicate security considerations. This is structurally more ambitious. It asks Washington to accept a distinction that the current administration has not shown appetite for accepting, and that would require conceding that Canada has legitimate independent judgment about its own commercial interests. But it is also the counter-proposal that several of Canada's European and Asian allies might quietly support because it creates a template that middle powers in NATO and other Western-aligned frameworks might themselves want to use. If Canada can establish that security cooperation does not require commercial policy conformity, it creates a precedent that limits Washington's ability to use security relationships as leverage for commercial demands across the entire Western alliance. That precedent has value to every G7 and G20 nation that maintains security alignment with Washington while wanting commercial relationships with Beijing. The political difficulty of this scenario is that it requires Washington to publicly accept a limitation on its leverage that the current administration has been building rather than restraining. The question is whether the strategic benefit of a stable, committed Canadian security partner is worth the political cost of acknowledging Canadian commercial sovereignty in the bilateral relationship. The third scenario is the long game. Canada refuses to dismantle what it has built, absorbs the continued economic pain, keeps constructing the diversification architecture, and bets that 12 months from now the leverage calculation looks different. Different because more of the alternative trade relationships will be producing revenue rather than just promise. Different because the global investment community will have further demonstrated through capital allocation that it treats Canada as a stable strategic asset rather than an economy under terminal American economic pressure. Different because other Western allies who have been quietly watching the Canada-US dynamic will have drawn their own conclusions about the sustainability of Washington's demands and may have begun creating their own pressures for a recalibration. This is the highest risk path and the highest potential reward, but it depends entirely on a variable that no external analysis can measure accurately. How much political will exist inside Canada to absorb continued economic pain while the long game plays out? The steel worker in Hamilton whose margins are being compressed by tariffs, the auto worker in Windsor whose plant runs on cross-border supply chains that tariffs are actively disrupting, the small business owner who is paying more for American goods and receiving less for Canadian exports in the American market. These are not abstractions in an economic model. They are voters, and their patience with a long-term strategic bet that requires short-term sacrifice is not infinite. Diversification strategies are easy to announce in a press conference. They are politically difficult to sustain through electoral cycles, where ordinary people are asking not about the geopolitical chessboard, but about why their costs have gone up and when they are coming down. The question of which scenario becomes reality depends in large part on something that has received almost no analytical attention in the coverage of this negotiation. What does Canada's counteroffer actually look like? And what leverage does Ottawa bring to that conversation that it did not have 12 months ago? Because Carney is not negotiating from the same position he would have been in at the beginning of this trade dispute. He is negotiating with the largest aircraft order in Canadian history recently signed in a Quebec facility. He is negotiating with foreign direct investment running at record levels. He is negotiating with more than 20 economic partnerships signed across 5 continents. He is negotiating as the leader of a country that just demonstrated to the global business community that it can sustain a diversification strategy under significant external pressure. That demonstration has a market value. It tells international investors and trading partners that Canada is a reliable long-term partner whose commitments survive political pressure from powerful neighbors. That reliability is worth something in negotiations. It is worth something that did not exist 12 months ago when the diversification strategy was still largely aspirational. The specific leverage Carney brings to this conversation is the demonstrated capacity to sustain the alternative architecture that Washington is trying to dismantle. An alternative architecture that is already producing results, and that shifts the negotiating dynamic from what the tariff pressure was supposed to produce, which was capitulation from weakness, towards something more like negotiation between parties who both have something the other wants and neither can simply take. What Washington wants is Canada's alignment on China trade policy, specifically the reversal of the Beijing electric vehicle and steel tariff commitments, and the symbolic demonstration that a G7 nation cannot sustain an independent commercial relationship with Beijing under American pressure. What Washington is offering is tariff relief that has real economic value for Canadian workers in specific sectors, and that reduces the short-term pain that the long-game scenario requires Canadian voters to absorb. What Canada wants is the preservation of the agricultural market access that canola farmers depend on, the maintenance of the diversification strategy's credibility as a long-term framework rather than a temporary experiment, and the establishment of a principle that Canada has legitimate commercial sovereignty within its security alliance with the United States. What Canada is offering through the openness to Fortress North America that it has publicly expressed is exactly the kind of deep integration and secure partnership that a genuinely mutual North American economic framework would provide. The negotiation between those two sets of wants and offers is the space where a deal that serves both countries' long-term interests could be constructed. But constructing it requires both parties to think beyond the immediate pressure dynamics and toward the structural question of what the Canada-US relationship needs to look like over the decade ahead to serve the genuine interests of both populations. There is one more analytical dimension that deserves explicit attention because it reveals something important about the limits of the current approach. The workers and businesses on both sides of the border who are paying the immediate price for the current trade friction did not choose to be in the middle of a geopolitical competition between two visions of global economic organization. The auto worker in Windsor, whose plant runs on cross-border supply chains, did not vote on whether Canada should sign the Beijing Agreement or whether Washington should impose tariffs in response. The farmer in Saskatchewan did not choose to have her canola market restored and threatened in the same 6-month window. The consumer on both sides of the border paying elevated prices for goods that cross the shared border multiple times before reaching a retail shelf is not a participant in the strategic calculation. They are its consequence. And the geopolitical chess match happening at the top of the governmental hierarchy produces very specific, very material, very immediate consequences for people at the bottom of the economic distribution who have the least capacity to absorb price increases and the least political influence over the decisions generating them. Any analysis of this negotiation that treats it purely as a strategic game between governments without acknowledging the human material at the center of the board is not complete. The people in Windsor and Hamilton and Saskatchewan and Ontario are what makes the choice between scenarios not a purely strategic calculation, but a moral one. How much pain is it legitimate to ask ordinary people to absorb in service of a long-term strategic bet they were never explicitly asked to endorse? That is the question underneath the question. And it is the one that makes the long-game scenario the most strategically optimal and the most politically difficult simultaneously. Here's where this leaves the situation on May 16, 2026. Washington has made an offer. The offer is real tariff relief conditioned on dismantling the Beijing Agreement. Canada has not publicly accepted or rejected that offer. The negotiation is in the space between the offer and the response where the actual shape of any eventual deal will be determined. The three scenarios, sectoral alignment, security carve-out, and the long game, represent the realistic range of outcomes, and each one produces consequences that extend far beyond the bilateral Canada-US relationship into the broader question of how medium and small economies navigate the space between two superpowers in a world where both are demanding conformity to their respective visions of global economic organization. Beijing is watching. Capitals across Southeast Asia, Africa, and Latin America are watching. The Western European allies, who have been carefully quiet about this specific dispute, are watching. What happens in Ottawa's response to Washington's conditional exemption offer will produce a signal that travels to all of them simultaneously. A signal either that independent trade judgment by Western-aligned nations is viable under American pressure, or that sufficient pressure reverses independent judgment reliably enough that no nation should bet its commercial strategy on the stability of its own decisions when Washington objects. That is the stakes. That is why this matters beyond Canada and the United States. That is why the question of what Mark Carney puts in the return message to Washington's offer is not a bilateral trade policy question. It is a question about the architecture of the global economy for the decade ahead. And the answer to it is being written right now in rooms that are not broadcasting their deliberations, but whose output will define the strategic landscape that every economy on Earth navigates going forward. Drop your analysis in the comments. The situation is moving. Subscribe and hit the notification bell because when Ottawa's response is delivered, the reaction to it from Washington and from Beijing will tell you more about the shape of the coming decade than any summit communique or tariff announcement could convey on its own. The choice is live. The clock is running. And the consequences belong to everyone, not just the governments making the decision.